History abounds in tales of magical objects. Rings, bottles, cloaks, books, swords, and mirrors. From Snow White to the most recent Conjuring film, magical mirrors are a staple of magic in both history and mythology. And from trapping spirits to reflecting the future, detecting thieves, or locating buried treasure, even early 20th century Halloween customs were thought to allow one to see one's future husband in mirrors. Such magic mirrors have served a range of functions. But what do we know about actual historical magical mirrors? And perhaps our best example to just such a question is a mirror to be found in the necromantic literature of the late Middle Ages, and in those forbidden tomes, we find a surprisingly common procedure for producing what those texts call the Mirror of Floron. And even more surprisingly, an example of just such a mirror, the Mirror of Floron, has actually survived the ravages of time. So, how are such mirrors made? What was their magical function? Who was that spirit, or demon for that matter, Floron, associated with these mirrors? And how did such mirrors even work in the minds of the sorcerers that produced them? Let's explore the magical mirror of Floron. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica if you're interested in weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work, providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this episode, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon or the cool merch that we have available on the channel, including one featuring the Mirror of Floron. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get the lay of the land, make sure to check out my study guide. And if you're interested in historical books on the topics in the occult and the mystical, check out my bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. And you can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the necromantic mirror of the spirit Floron. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. I think many of us will admit that mirrors are a bit strange, uncanny even. Stare in them too long, and many of us begin to experience a strange dysphoric sensation. Perhaps the sureness of reality on this side of the mirror itself becomes just so slightly unhinged. We may be even unsure, existentially unsure, who's gazing at whom. Mirrors invoke this liminal sensation. They can distort, reflect, refract, invert, stretch, and even repeat appearances to infinity. It's even customary in some cultures to cover them after a death in the family, as if they serve as portals to the other side, or perhaps even more horribly as spiritual traps for the deceased. Of course, shattering a mirror is said to cause bad luck, as if malevolent spirits were somehow released from the shards. Cornelius Agrippa, the composer of the famed 3 books of occult philosophy, even held that mirrors could trap qualities of those that gaze long into them. Thus he argues that the loose morals of a sex worker could be trapped and then transmitted to a goodly woman if she were to peer into the former's mirror. And for much of history, many people rarely even had access to mirrors at all, as they were elite prestige items, with royals even having members of their court as mirror polishers. Thus, it's no wonder at all that mirrors have come to be thought of as somehow uncannily powerful. But if mirrors simply as mirrors seem to have such an eldritch power, what then of those what were made by binding spiritual or demonic power to a mirror and the production of that mirror? And the use of reflective sources from liquids in bowls, the polished surface of swords, crystal spheres, and especially the anointed fingers of children have long been used in the magical practice known as scrying. The 12th century cleric John of Salisbury, who would become the Bishop of Chartres, actually recounts how as a child his Latin tutor would have the students gaze into basins or their anointed fingernails to see spiritual creatures. John recounts how he saw nothing himself, but his friend did see misty figures in the basins. And similar rituals involving a child by writing the magical word agla on the polished nail wrapped in red silk were also employed. The magister or magician would sit behind the child's scryer, whispering magical incantations into their ear, and the child would recount what they saw in their polished, enchanted nail. The physician Johannes Hartlieb recounts the use of children peering into similar magical basins. Polished thumbnails, steel mirrors, and even the surface of swords, especially swords used for executions, to induce visions of spirits, demons, angels, and visions of the dead. But to what end was all this done? Most often, it was used in the recovery of stolen items. It was divination to detect thievery. From a tenant stealing meat from a lord to stolen law books, most of these accounts employ scrying to detect thieves, a magical tradition that reaches all the way back to the late antique days of the Greek magical papyri. But why were children most often used in this scrying? Most scholars suspect that they were thought to simply be pure. They were thought to be virgins, and thus as kind of blank slates, and thus more easily and more surely able to induce and report the visions that they saw. I mean, even now we say things like drunks and children always tell the truth, though whoever says that hasn't spent much time around drunks or children. My children definitely lie to me all the time. Of course, such scrying was also used to detect another hidden item. Treasure. You knew it was coming. Gazing into stones to detect buried treasure, along with the spirits said to guard that treasure, reached back to the Middle Ages and beyond, and were especially highlighted in the Enochian magic of Dr. John Dee and his very non-child scryer Edward Kelly, down to the great American prophet Joseph Smith, who was known as Peepstone Joe before he turned those visions toward buried gold plates in Reformed Egyptian. And mentioning John Dee, by the way, scrying using crystal balls was at the core of the revelation of the Enochian magic. Though while he's associated with an obsidian mirror now in the British Museum, there's actually no evidence he ever owned or used that mirror. Rather, he employed a couple of very small crystal balls or spheres, which he actually depicts in the scrying sessions themselves in the diaries that record those. But the point remains, at the heart of one of the most celebrated magical operations in Western history lies the magical practice of scrying, of peering into a surface to see things. And regardless, numerous examples of such scrying via reflective surfaces, especially mirrors, were core to the development of Western magic. But how did such magical mirrors, from the thumbnails of children to the reflective polish of an executioner's sword, how did those surfaces work in the mind of the necromancers that employed them? Well, there are four primary theories that were forwarded during this position. The first is the classic position of the church. It was demons. Because of course it was demons. I mean, that's just it. It's always a position of the church. That is to say, demons take advantage of the credulity of such sorcerers, and they induce visions in the imagination of those sorcerers as part of the demonic long con of damning their souls. Of course, this position primarily originates in St. Augustine, and this was the official policy on the church on basically all magical practices. So the second was forwarded by the Islamic philosopher Ibn Khaldun, and he argued that sight itself was, at least in part, a kind of emission from the mind via the eyes. This emission, and the idea of sight as an emission rather than just capturing light, wasn't that uncommon of a position during this period and going back to antiquity. But that emission contained mental data which is then projected upon the surface of the reflective object, a bit like film is projected onto a screen. Thus, what people were seeing projected is actually their own imagination projected outward via this ocular emission and then basically bounced back into their mind. Now, this naturalistic explanation is a precursor to contemporary psychological, even neurological conclusions as to how such practices can induce hypnagogic, dreamlike states in the right settings, a thing well attested in the psychological literature. A more Neoplatonic position was set forward by people like Petrus Garcia in the late 15th century. He, while attacking the conclusions of Pico della Mirandola, he forwarded that such sorcerers held that as one gazed into the surface, the contents of one's soul were emptied out, such that the immortal soul peers back into itself in an increasingly purified state. The soul, being timeless, of course, gazes back unto itself and is thus able to see beyond the confines of the present space and time, and thus sees at distance through both. Thus, on this understanding, scrying was a kind of feedback loop into the purification of the soul, such that the soul itself was better able to spiritually perceive reality in that reflective surface. As you look, the soul empties out, and as the soul empties out, you're able to look deeper into one's old soul and see in a spiritual light. And in that way, the soul wasn't bound by space or time, and it could see at vast distances in space through time. The final theory is something of an extension of this more Neoplatonic theory, and it brings us to the star of this episode. On this theory, one could induce astral or demonic forces, or both, why not both, into a mirror and either bind or conjure them so as to use their abilities to perceive through space and time. Recall that demonic beings, or daemonic beings, aren't bound by physical limitations and can travel vast distances, basically immediate. They have an enormous ancient knowledge because of their great antiquity, and of course they even know the locations of vast sums of buried treasure because they've been storing all of it up for the eventual coming of the Antichrist. Yep, that was a pretty common idea as to why medieval necromancers believed that demons knew where all the world's buried treasure was, because basically it was a giant demonic credit union for the coming Antichrist. And they would tell you they could go dig it up and then they would basically kill you. But on this line of reasoning, a mirror could be used to induce a vision of such a demon, daimon, or supernatural creature, such that you could interrogate them about what have you. And that's exactly what we have in one of the best preserved group of spells for the production of a magical mirror from the late Middle Ages, the production of the Mirror of Floron. Preserved in more than half a dozen grimoires, this was a popular idea, many of them now concentrated in Germany and England. Spells for the production of the Mirror of Floron seem to have been rather popular. Indeed, they seem to have abounded in the medieval period, perhaps making this one of, if not the most popular magical mirror in all of medieval necromancy. And even more shocking, an actual example of the mirror survives down to this day from some time in that period. But the purposes of this episode, I want to look at the spell for creating the Mirror of Floron as it occurs in the classic CLM 849, better known as the Munich Necromancer's Manual. There we find not one, but two experiments, experimenti, as the text has it, for creating the mirror. There are lots of different divinatory experiments in CLM 849, including one for making a mirror of Lilith, or Billet, which I've actually covered in another episode if you want to check out the Mirror of Lilith. But to make the Mirror of Floron, one takes pure steel, shapes it into a mirror shape, and polishes its surface bright and shiny like a sword. Then, around the unpolished rim, one inscribes the names of 10 various demons with their sigils, along with Floron's name in the center of the mirror. Interestingly, the sigil of Floron isn't present, at least in this specific conjuration, but it does occur in one of the Leipzig necromantic manuals. The mirror is then anointed and fumigated with balsam, aloe, ambergris, myrrh, and frankincense, and I suspect some of this anointing with oil also helps to further increase the polish of the mirror. But, having bathed and donning fresh garments, a virgin boy is then made to hold the mirror while the necromancer sprinkles equal parts honey, milk, and wine into the air, conjuring Floron to appear quickly and in the mirror. Following this conjuration is a sequence of nomina barbara, or magical words, which begins, curiously enough, with Bismillah Aratheh, with several other words after that ending in the sound im. Yeah, that Bismillah Aratheh is very probably just a corruption of the beginning of the Arabic Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the gracious, the most compassionate, and all those words ending in the sound im might just have been Hebrew or Arabic plurals. Also, the need for ritual purity via bathing is also another hint of the origins of this magic, perhaps in Arabic or Jewish sources. But following the litany of Nomina Barbara, peering into the mirror will reveal a mounted knight with an attending squire. Once the knight dismounts, one greets the knight in what appears to be garbled Latin, after which one can inquire of the knight about things past, present, and future, for which the answers will be, at least in first, given in writing, perhaps a kind of automatic writing performed maybe by the boy holding the mirror somehow. But after having done the spell 9 times, the spirit will begin to answer orally, face to face. But once you've concluded your line of questioning, one grants the spirit to return to his master. Presumably Floron, I suppose, is his master, or the knight is Floron. It's not clear, but they go in peace. A second set of instructions for the second Mirror of Floron is actually even more specific. The mirror is to be made under the first hour on a Friday under a waxing moon. The maker of the mirror must be chaste for 9 days prior to its construction, and the greeting to the knight is now denoted as being in Chaldean, that is to say Aramaic, but that greeting, parate insolitio gaitromon, definitely isn't Aramaic. Also, the knight will now reveal things in writing during the night, but orally during the day, and he reveals all things under the moon, and he provides the holder with +1 to their intelligence. It actually doesn't do that last part, but it should. Further, the text also provides us with an illustration of the magical inscription to be written upon the Mirror of Floron itself in 6 rectangular blocks, Floron, and those 6 rectangular blocks surrounded by the names and sigils of the various spirits. So we get an illustration of how the mirror is supposed to look. But, curiously enough, other books of magic also preserve techniques for producing a similar, though definitely not identical, Mirror of Floron. All, however, do preserve the basic configuration of spirit names and sigils around the exterior, with Floron's name in the center, sometimes in a hexagram, and others just sort of haphazardly written there on the mirror. In Cambridge University Library Additional Manuscript 3544, which has been published and I'll link below, it's attributed to Paul Forman and was written sometime in the 1540s or so, we find another ritual for producing another steel mirror, though the spirit now is here called Failberry, but it's probably a variant of Floron. Although this mirror is actually written onto the steel in special consecrated ink, rather than being cut into the steel itself. The various 8 or so surviving manuscripts differ substantially on the names of the various spirits, with the exception of Floron, of course, and their sigils, though I have to say there is some graphical continuity all the same. Again, this is just typical of the kind of fluidity that we see in magical manuals in general, with Nomina Barbara, sigils, and the spelling of the names often greatly mutating from magical manuscript tradition to manuscript tradition. But as I've been showing on the screen, we're actually lucky to have a surviving example of such a Mirror of Floron, held now in Dresden in Germany. It is a wonderful and fascinating piece of actual magical history taken from necromantic history itself. But what do we know about Floron? What do we know about this specific spirit? The name sounds vaguely Greek. It sounds vaguely like the Latin word for flower. And I think it's a refrigerant gas now. And while Floron isn't among the who's who of spirits, there are no Asmodeus or even a Paimon, but Floron does show up more than you might think. An early attestation of them is to be found in the necromantic commentary on the De Sfera by Cecco in the early 14th century. That commentary, along with some lectures and some court drama, got him burned at the stake in 1327. You can check out my episode on Cecco and the world of astral necromancy if you want to learn more about him. He should have had a magic mirror to seen that coming. I also believe that Floron is mentioned in the monumental 14th century Summa Sacra Magici, one of the most important manuals of all time for medieval magic. A slightly later text, The Life of Cola de Rienzo, recounts finding a mirror with magical signs written upon it associated with a demon the text called Fiorone, perhaps a version of Floron. Giordano Bruno, for his part, also mentions Floron as a spirit associated with various oracles, as a prince of the Arctic, and associated with the constellation Ursus Major. Interestingly, the Speculum Solomonis sive Sphera Universae Sapienti et Scientiae, or easier said, Leipzig Magical Codex number 78, seems to also link Floron with Mercury and provides his sigil actually, which appears to have been written on the face of the mirror. Further corruptions of this name through the association of the French word fleur may also link Floron with other such grimoires in as Flavros or Flavos and the Lesser Key of Solomon, or maybe in the Grand Grimoire as Fluti or Fluretti. It's not clear. These could all be corruptions of the name Floron, or Floron could be a corruption of these names. But Floron may be haunting the grimoire tradition much more than commonly thought. Regardless, the Mirror of Floron is one of our best insights into how medieval magical mirrors were created, how they worked, and what their purpose ultimately was. And with the survival of just such an actual mirror, we're lucky enough to be able to study a true necromantic relic, a rare survival of an object that would have otherwise been hunted and destroyed by the powers that be. Thus, scrying, beholding spirits on reflective surfaces through the thumbnails of children, basins of liquid, the gleaming sword of an executioner, or a mirror, like the Mirror of Lilith or the Mirror of Floron, give us a glimpse into the theory, practice, and history of magic, one that was surprisingly widespread and well attested, with mentions in medieval Italy, Germany, a German relic, manuscripts that spread all the way from Germany to England. Thus, while the Mirror of Floron is obscure to us now, it was clearly important to the clerical necromantic underground. In fact, I would suspect that an entire monograph-length study or dissertation, for all you would-be graduate students out there, would actually be a wonderful project to study the Mirror of Floron as part of a general world of magical mirrors. Sophie Page has put out a wonderful text on some of these magical mirrors, and of course you can also consult Richard Kiekeffer's edition of the Munich Necromancer's Manual if you want to study these mirrors and other forms of late medieval necromantic divination. Also, special thanks to viewer Mike Davis, who emailed me several years ago actually about the Mirror of Floron with lots of helpful information that ended up in this episode, so thanks Mike. Of course, more on magical items to come in the future. There's just so many of them. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.